Russian shipyard is ablaze, sparking claims of sabotage as more than 100 Ukrainian drones have forced Moscow to close 3 of its 4 airports. Kharkiv again. My name is Jerome Starkey. I'm the defence editor at The Sun newspaper, and this is Frontline, your weekly roundup of the most important news and analysis from the war in Ukraine. We'll start with that fire in the Onega shipyard, around 600 miles north of the closest Ukrainian territory. Still too early to tell what has caused it, but given the months-long, years-long campaign of successful long-range Ukrainian drone strikes, it has sparked suggestions that this could be part of that campaign. And the reason we're looking at it today is because of its connections to Nikolai Patrushev, a former boss of Russia's FSB intelligence service, which makes this shipyard more interesting perhaps than others. It has a role repairing vessels. It has been linked to the Russian war effort. Patrushev is interesting because he's a very close ally of President Putin, and his son Dmitry, a banker turned politician who's currently one of Russia's deputy prime ministers, is a name that is constantly mentioned when people discuss who may or may not replace Vladimir Putin. We'll await more news on what has caused that fire and indeed whether or not it is significant in terms of Russia's war effort. But nonetheless, it comes after Russia has suffered other losses and other attacks. Russia saying overnight that Ukraine launched more than 100 drones, and that's what forced it to close 3 of the 4 main airports. They were Vnukovo, Zhukovsky and Domodedovo, not, however, the main international Sheremetyevo airport. Forgive my Russian pronunciations there. Comes after Russia this week also lost a TU-22M bomber. These are sweep-wing bombers, nuclear-capable bombers, valuable weapons, valuable aircraft for Russia, worth about £50 million each. They had just under 60 before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, according to the IISS think tank. Ukraine claimed that number was halved in the first 18 months of the war due to combat losses and crashes. No suggestion that this crash in Irkutsk in Siberia was caused by anything other than either mechanical failure or pilot error. No suggestion that it was an act of war, but nonetheless a significant loss to Russia. Interesting also that while Russia said Ukraine overnight had fired over 100 drones, Ukraine suggesting that actually Russia had fired far fewer. It's felt perhaps like the tempo of the war has turned down a notch. Now, I'm wary of saying that because I think clearly for the soldiers who are fighting on the front lines and we're going to come to the battlefield in a minute, actually a lot of that ground campaign remains as bloody and intense as ever. But some suggestions perhaps that the airstrikes have reduced. Just looking at Ukraine, the Ukrainian Air Force's sort of nightly tallies of the Shahed drones, the Russian Shahed drones they've launched. The numbers have been in the 20s and the 40s this week. There was one night when Russia launched 2 Kh-59 missiles, but there have been other nights when Russia has launched hundreds of drones and missiles in these vast combined attacks. There have also been very fragile, so tentative signs that perhaps the White House is cooling its relations with the Kremlin. This is significant and very hard to predict because of the mercurial nature of Donald Trump. But after what's really felt like this love-in between Trump and Putin, America's NBC is reporting that Donald Trump's close aides in the White House have urged the American president not to call Vladimir Putin until Moscow makes significant concessions towards a ceasefire. Trump's promise of ending the war in a day is in tatters. His efforts to end the war quickly have not stalled, but they have slowed down as negotiations appear to be getting bogged down in details. And Russia, whilst it has reluctantly agreed to these ceasefires, or the pause on strikes on energy infrastructure and a ceasefire in the Black Sea, documents details of exactly what those agreements entail have not been made public. And assessments of Russia, both by President Trump and indeed by his intelligence agencies and many analysts around the world, is that Moscow's playing for time. These are only tentative suggestions of a cooling of relations, because actually at the same time what we've also seen this week is the US Treasury lift sanctions on the wife of a billionaire Russian oligarch. Now, Karina Rottenberg has had the sanctions on her lifted. She is an American citizen. Her husband, Russian billionaire close to Putin, appears to have made or put lots of his money into sort of gas pipeline infrastructure. It's not clear. The Treasury didn't explain why they've lifted those sanctions. This could be, but this is only speculative, that it's some sort of gesture of goodwill, some confidence building measure linked to the sanctions, or it could be unrelated. It could be because of her American citizenship. She has continued to travel despite the sanctions and despite the war in Ukraine, living this extraordinary sort of jet set lifestyle, in expensive resorts in the south of France. They own sort of strings. She's involved in horses, equestrian life in Russia, the trappings of the wealthy and the famous. Also this week we've seen President Zelensky set out one of his red lines for these negotiations, and that was about the size of the army. He said he absolutely will not accept shrinking Ukraine's armed forces. Now, previously what he said he's wanted is security guarantees from outside, well, crucially from NATO, but from allies to guarantee any peace. What Moscow's been pressing for is no NATO involvement, no security guarantees. America has said they won't. That's something Donald Trump has said they won't. And Russia has also wanted Ukraine to sort of shrink its armed forces. One of Russia's proposals at the beginning of the war was to effectively try and make Ukraine a sort of neutral, unarmed state. That is unacceptable to Kyiv because they do not want to leave themselves vulnerable to another Russian attack. In fact, everything that you see Ukraine saying and doing about these negotiations is trying to guarantee the longevity of any peace agreement, because as far as they're concerned, they've been here before. They signed the Budapest Memoranda, which effectively where America, France and Britain agreed to respect and support Ukraine's territorial integrity when they gave up their nuclear weapons. That deal lies in tatters. They have tried repeatedly to sign peace deals with the Russians, the Minsk agreements, accords, since Russia annexed Crimea and seized parts of eastern Ukraine in 2014, and they repeatedly failed. So longevity is important to Ukraine. Quick summary of what's been happening on the battlefield, and I hinted at it a second ago. The fighting remains ferocious. Both sides have been gaining little bits of territory. We'll start in northeastern or northern Sumy province. That's where Ukraine launched its attack into Kursk. Ukrainian forces still have a rump of territory in Kursk, but it is shrinking down from about 70 square kilometers to the low 60s. These are small gains by the Russians, but actually what the Russians have done is they've invaded Russian territory either side of that Ukrainian salient, and that's significant because it does leave Ukraine vulnerable to those soldiers vulnerable to getting surrounded. There's only really one main road in and out of that Ukrainian position, and the Russians have been attacking either side of it, to the east and west of that road, advancing into Ukrainian territory. Ukraine also holds a little bit of territory in Russia's Belgorod as a result of one of these offensive. Russia attacking heavily there as well. No hugely significant advances across the rest of the front line, but we understand Ukraine has advanced around Pokrovsk. That was an area that's been a real focus of Russian forces for months. But Russians have advanced south of Pokrovsk in Kharkova and indeed to the north around Toretsk. Toretsk was an interesting place to focus on because the Ukrainians had been advancing there for some weeks. That appears to have stalled and it's gone slightly the other way. But again, this appears to be all within the bounds of the kind of tit for tat, but deadly nonetheless and ferocious nonetheless battlefield maneuvers, tactical battlefield maneuvers. Wanted to talk briefly about the American annual threat assessment by the US intelligence community. So this is a joint threat assessment by all of America's spy and intelligence agencies, and significant because it sets out what they think about Russia and Ukraine, and crucially the first assessment that we've had since Donald Trump has returned to office, and under his Director of National Intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who was a controversial choice. We're focusing on what it says about Russia, and I'll try and summarize it. It says fundamentally Russia is a secondary threat in terms of state actors to China, and this helps us understand to some extent all of Donald Trump's actions around Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine. Russia, secondary to China. However, it states that Russia is very resilient. It's shown that resilience. It says Russia has seized the initiative in the war in Ukraine, and this attritional conflict is playing into Russia's strengths in terms of size and might and resilience. And that's resilience in terms of military resilience and economic resilience. The fact is it is weathering sanctions and is weathering losses. And the assessment says that it believes Vladimir Putin is prepared to continue paying a very, very high price. And that as a result of these sanctions, as a result of the war in Ukraine, Russia has been pushed closer to China, into alliances closer to North Korea and Iran. And the report talks about this forming a counterweight to US influence. And one of America's objectives is to try and peel Russia away from China, to split that alliance. And the suggestion in this assessment is that were the war to end, Russia's relations with China would revert to where they were in 2021. That might be perhaps optimistic. You know, clearly these alliances, particularly as we've seen military alliances with Iran and North Korea, are now reaching levels of significant reciprocity. Iran is sending Russia Shahed drones. Russia is sending Iran, for example, its Yak-130 trainer jets and other military equipment. North Korea is sending troops and huge volumes of artillery shells and other missiles. Russia, we understand, is prepared to provide training and potentially rocket technology, incredibly valuable rocket technology as well. As ever, thank you very much for sending in your questions. If you do have questions, please ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time, either on the next show or I'll get into the comments and answer them there as well. Question number one, we get it a lot, but it's an important question. Is Ukraine winning? The short answer is no. Russia has seized the initiative. Russian forces are advancing more than they are retreating. Their rate of advance has slowed, but nonetheless, I think as that that annual threat assessment from America said, Russia has the initiative at the moment, and this attritional war is playing into its strengths. But what I would say, and I've said this before as well, is that wars are not always linear. It's worth looking at what happened, for example, in World War II. The Allies were losing in North Africa. They were losing in continental Europe, really until sort of 1943, 1944, with victories against Rommel's Afrika Korps, and then the invasion of southern Europe and fighting up through Italy when the tide started to turn. Equally, NATO and America, the American-led invasion of Afghanistan successfully defeated the Taliban. The NATO-led ISAF mission was, to all intents and purposes, winning for many years. In fact, they perhaps foolishly thought that war was won, but fundamentally, ultimately, they lost. The Taliban came back to power. So conflicts are not always linear. Question number two, why the US shift in approach, Donald Trump's change in position from supporting Ukraine to sort of what has appeared to be, to outsiders, really realigning itself, realigning the White House with the Kremlin's aims. And of course, we've seen comments from the Kremlin where they have felt that Donald Trump's foreign policy objectives, I think Dmitry Peskov was the person who said this, that's Putin's spokesman, that Washington's foreign policy objectives aligned with its own. An extraordinary thing to hear coming out of the Kremlin. Well, there's a couple of explanations. I think fundamentally, Donald Trump wants to end the war. That is a good and noble objective. I say often, no sane person who's seen this conflict wants it to last a second longer than it has to. One possible explanation for this realignment with, the American alignment, at least Donald Trump's alignment, we should focus on, with Moscow, is that this could be part of Trump's negotiating strategy. This may be a slightly optimistic view, but Trump has written about trying to see deals from the other person's point of view and trying to sort of align yourself with those objectives to secure a deal. That doesn't mean he'll stay aligned all the way through, but essentially it's to get this negotiating process started. Final question for today is, are the North Korean forces in Russia illegal combatants? And is that a cause or justification for NATO sending in troops? We've had versions of this question before. It's a popular question. I'll answer it again. North Korean troops in Russia of their own are not a justification for NATO to send in combatants themselves. That's because Ukraine is not a NATO member, so it's not an Article 5 conflict. It is nonetheless, it's been a cause of great concern to NATO and evidence of the threat that NATO members feel that they face. Are the North Korean combatants illegal? Well, they are taking part in what Ukraine and its allies call an illegal and unprovoked war, but the North Korean soldiers in and of themselves are not illegal combatants. They are allies, they are uniformed soldiers who are from a sovereign ally of Russia, and at the moment they are fighting not in Ukraine. They are not, in that sense, not taking part in the illegal invasion. They are fighting on Russian soil, helping Russia to defend itself from what was a legitimate counterattack by Ukraine. So quite complicated, concerning of course to Ukraine and its allies, hugely concerning this North Korean involvement, but not a matter, as far as I can tell, of illegality. Thank you very much for your questions. If you do have any, please do ask them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as many as I can next time. We're in a Ukrainian armoured vehicle and we're heading towards the Russian border.